All right, let's get started then. Last night's talk I called from natural science to philosophy of nature. And the argument there, in a nutshell, Brian said a little bit more about it than I will right now to recap, but the argument in a nutshell, and the argument as summarized in the title, was that properly to understand natural science, or the very possibility of natural science, we need to think in terms of the idea of teleology, Aristotle's final cause, that there are purposes built into the natural order, built into material substances. So that was I was making a set of general points about the nature of material reality. And the relevance for our topic tonight is that laying that metaphysical foundation is essential to understanding how we get from the world in turn to God. Hence tonight's talk is called From Philosophy of Nature to Natural Theology. Now, anyone who studies philosophy in a contemporary university is bound to come away with a conviction that proving the existence of God is frightfully difficult at best and probably impossible. This is the reverse of what most philosophers have thought historically. It is also, in my view anyway, the reverse of the truth. In fact, it is not all that difficult to prove that God exists, or at least it is not all that difficult to prove that God exists given certain common sense assumptions about the way the world works, especially certain common sense assumptions about the nature of cause and effect. The greatest of the ancient medieval philosophers, and even some of the early modern ones, thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Al-Ghazali, Maimonides, Thomas Aquinas, Leibniz, to name just a few, certainly took this view. Why then do so many contemporary philosophers, and indeed so many academics and intellectuals in general, mistakenly believe that God's existence is difficult or even impossible to prove? That is a complicated issue, but the answer has much to do with the abandonment of Aristotle's philosophy of nature, and in particular final causes, an abandonment which, as I argued last night, was a serious mistake. What I want to talk about tonight is how we can in fact know there is a God, given a broadly Aristotelian understanding of nature, of the natural world, of material reality. Aquinas summarizes what he takes to be the most important arguments that philosophers have given for God's existence in the famous 5 ways, from the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas' famous 5 ways. My own view is that each of the 5 ways is cogent and, when properly understood, can be seen to be immune from the standard objections. The trouble is that, apart from those scholars who specialize in the study of medieval philosophy, very few contemporary writers on the atheism versus theism debate really do properly understand the arguments. This is part of the reason that arguments for the existence of God seem harder to defend than they really are. It's not that the arguments themselves aren't powerful, it's that any defender of the arguments has to clear away an enormous amount of intellectual rubbish if he's going to ensure that the arguments get a fair hearing. A fair hearing, that is to say, not merely or even primarily from the complete novice, but also and even especially from the so-called educated reader who thinks he already knows what the arguments say, but in fact knows nothing of the kind. That's why you've got to work through almost 100 pages of philosophy in my book, The Last Superstition, fairly abstract matters of metaphysics, and a long chapter on metaphysics in my book, Aquinas, before getting to any of the actual arguments for God's existence. Certain distinctively modern philosophical mistakes, especially mistakes about the nature of cause and effect, must be cleared up first. Certain extremely common caricatures of the arguments have to be exposed, lest the typical reader deeply misunderstand them from the very first line. For example, it's commonly thought that when Aquinas argues for a first cause of the world, what he says is something like this. This is a stock misunderstanding really, of Aquinas. Quote, everything has a cause, so the universe has a cause, namely God. That's the way people often understand the first cause argument. The standard atheist retort to this argument is, of course, to ask, well, if everything has a cause, then what caused God? And if you say God has no cause, then maybe the universe didn't either. There, we've finished off Aquinas. The atheist chuckles disdainfully and pats himself on the back for exposing Aquinas as incapable of spotting the most blatant of fallacies. The trouble is that Aquinas never gave this silly argument in the first place. He never says everything has a cause. Indeed, none of the best-known defenders of the first cause argument for the existence of God, not Plato, not Aristotle, not Al-Ghazali, not Maimonides, not Aquinas, not Duns Scotus, not Leibniz, not Samuel Clarke, not Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, not Mortimer Adler, not William Lane Craig, not Richard Swinburne. We can go on with this list. Not one of them ever gave this silly argument. None of them ever claimed everything has a cause, quote unquote. Not one of them ever committed so obvious a fallacy in arguing for God's existence, if they committed any fallacies at all. And yet you will find atheist after atheist characterizing this obviously fallacious argument as the basic argument for the first cause, as if everything else that any of these major philosophers had to say about the first cause argument were just a pathetic attempt to patch up an obviously weak case. As I show in my book, this is just one of the many urban legends that pop atheists like Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and Hitchens rely on to give their position whatever rhetorical power that it has. And the word rhetorical here is key. The fact that there's been this urban legend, I don't know how old it is, it'd be interesting, you could probably write a book on just tracing the history of this urban legend that the cosmological argument is everything has a cause, the universe has a cause. The idea that that's the basic argument, you find that in textbook after textbook. And even when writers on the subject go on to discuss more sophisticated versions of the argument, they're often presented as if they were just attempts to kind of patch up the holes in this basic, obviously fallacious, bad argument. And that does a lot of the rhetorical work, that sort of move in atheist polemics, in the writings of the new atheists in particular, because it makes it sound like the theist, the defender of God's existence, right out of the gate, gives you an argument that's so stupid that a child could refute it. And everything else he has to say then just sounds like he's trying to prop up desperately this creaky structure, right? It's pure rhetoric, because no one ever gave this argument, but it's often presented either as the argument or at least as the basic idea of a first cause argument. And none of that's true. None of these writers ever gave an argument like that. Certainly Aquinas doesn't. Now here's another common misunderstanding of Aquinas' arguments. It is usually assumed that when Aquinas argues for a first cause, what he means is that if we trace the history of the universe backward in time, we'll eventually reach a beginning point, something like the Big Bang, as we would describe it today. And then, so to suppose, his claim is that God must have been the cause of the Big Bang. But that is not what Aquinas says. In fact, Aquinas explicitly denies that we can show through philosophical or scientific arguments that the universe had a beginning. While he did, in fact, personally believe that it had a beginning on the basis of biblical revelation, he doesn't think that that's the sort of claim that one should rely on in arguing for God's existence. He doesn't take that approach. In fact, Aquinas thought that the existence of God as a first cause of the world can be proved conclusively even if we assume, for the sake of argument, that the world had no beginning. He's not even getting into that issue for the purposes of arguing for the existence of God. The Big Bang theory is not the only modern scientific idea commonly but falsely assumed to be crucially relevant to the question of God's existence. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is also generally thought to have leveled an awfully damaging blow to belief in God, especially in the work of people like Richard Dawkins. You see this a bit in Hitchens as well. You'd think that Darwinism, all by itself, single-handedly, Darwin with one hand tied behind his back, destroyed any possible basis for believing in God. And Dawkins is the kind of writer who thinks Darwin, solved every problem. Darwinism cures wooden legs, cures every problem. And he certainly thinks somehow that it destroys any possibility of ever being a theist. But the question of Darwinism is, in fact, totally irrelevant to any of the 5 ways. The prospects for demonstrating God's existence might seem even dimmer if we extend the evolutionary idea beyond biology and account for the origin of our universe in terms of its having branched off from some other universe, as part perhaps of some series of branching universes that extends forever backward in time and across an indefinitely large number of sub-universes within a larger multiverse. This is the multiverse concept. In fact, however, neither Darwin's theory, as I already said, nor the latest speculations of theoretical physicists cast the slightest doubt on the classical proofs for God's existence. That neither of those ideas is at all relevant, one way or the other, to certainly Aquinas' arguments for God. The point is not that those theories are false. I'm not saying Darwinism's wrong or that the multiverse concept is wrong. You don't have to get into those issues one way or the other. The point is that whether they're true or false, in other words, is completely irrelevant to arguments like Aquinas' 5 ways. The reason is that Aquinas is not giving empirical scientific arguments, but rather philosophical or metaphysical ones. That emphatically does not mean that he is not giving rational arguments. It means that not all rational arguments are empirical scientific ones. Mathematics is certainly rational. Many philosophers have taken it to be the paradigm of rational thinking, the gold standard of rationality, but it's not a branch of empirical science. Metaphysics, too, is perfectly rational, even though it is not a branch of empirical science either. And what metaphysics is concerned with is not this or that feature of the natural world, but rather with the preconditions of there being a natural world for empirical science to study in the first place. Metaphysics begins with what empirical science takes for granted and thus answers questions that empirical science itself cannot possibly answer. For example, physics, chemistry, biology, and the like all presuppose that there is a natural world, that the things that make up this world undergo changes of various kinds, that they exhibit patterns of cause and effect, and so forth. But how is it possible for there to be a natural world in the first place? How is change possible? How are cause and effect relations possible? Natural science can't possibly answer these questions precisely because its very methods presuppose the existence of the things being asked about. But traditional metaphysics does answer them. And what it says is that the only possible way to answer these questions, the only possible way to explain how there can be a natural world or change or cause and effect, is to appeal to a first uncaused cause who has the attributes definitive of God as traditionally conceived. What it says is not merely that the world must have been created by such a first cause at some point in the past, but rather that the world couldn't possibly exist here and now, and that change couldn't possibly be occurring here and now, and that causes couldn't possibly be producing their effects here and now unless there were a first uncaused cause who is here and now, and at any moment at which we might be asking these questions, is keeping the world in existence, keeping change going, keeping causes operative. Now, why exactly? Well, let's turn at last then to the traditional proofs of God's existence. Given time constraints, I'm going to focus on just one of them, the one that Aquinas regarded as the most evident argument for the existence of God. It's generally known as the argument from motion, was first sketched out by Plato, developed in detail by Aristotle in the physics and the metaphysics, refined by various medieval philosophers, and summarized by Aquinas as the first of his 5 ways. And of course, Aquinas discusses it elsewhere as well. Now, by motion, Aquinas, following Aristotle, means change in general, not just motion as we tend to think of it these days, not just movement from place to place, that is to say. And what the argument seeks to show is that no change at all would be possible here and now unless there were a first unmoved mover or unchanged changer, which is moving or changing everything here and now. For those who are interested, I defend 2 of Aquinas' other arguments in the last superstition. I discussed 3 of Aquinas' arguments. And it's important to emphasize there, as I may have discussed last night, these are not just Aquinas' arguments. Sometimes people object to this sort of defense I would give of God's existence, as I appeal to Aquinas frequently, by saying, well, how plausible is it that one guy, this guy Thomas Aquinas, could have hit upon the truth and everyone else before and after was wrong. It's important to emphasize that Aquinas, when he gives these arguments, is not inventing them out of whole cloth. He didn't make these arguments up. What he's doing is presenting, and at most somewhat refining, arguments that really have a long history, both before his time and afterward. They began, as I indicated, with Plato and Aristotle, and they've continued to be developed and defended by other Thomists, followers of Aquinas, since Aquinas' time. So we're talking about arguments that have a long history of very prominent, very eminent defenders. And I discuss all of the 5 ways in greater depth in my book on Aquinas, which is titled very creatively, Aquinas. Now, to understand the argument from motion or change, the one we're going to focus on tonight, we need to say something about how Aquinas understands change. Following Aristotle, he takes motion or change always to involve a transition from potentiality to actuality, from things being potentially a certain way to them being actually that way. For example, when a billiard ball rolls into the corner pocket, it goes from being merely potentially in the corner pocket to being actually in the corner pocket. When a rubber ball in a microwave oven melts, it goes from being potentially soft and gooey to being actually soft and gooey. When a dog moves its leg, its muscles go from having the potential to flex to actually flexing, and so forth. For Aristotle and Aquinas, there's no way to explain how change is possible at all unless we suppose that things have within them the potential to become what they become. The billiard ball could not possibly enter the corner pocket unless it first had the potential to do so. The rubber ball couldn't melt unless it had the potential to melt. The dog's leg muscles could not flex unless they had the potential to flex, and so on and so forth. Now, this might seem to be a very simple and obvious point, and at one level it is. But as it happens, the Aristotelian distinction between actuality and potentiality, or between act and potency, to use the more traditional jargon, has tremendous philosophical significance and has been a matter of considerable philosophical controversy. Aristotle first introduced it in order to explain what was wrong with the view of the pre-Socratic philosophers Parmenides and Zeno that change is impossible. Parmenides notoriously argued that change was impossible. Nothing ever changes. If your senses tell you, you say, well, Feser's up there flapping his lips. That's change, right? He's going from not speaking to speaking, right? And talking and talking and talking, right? So change is possible, right? Parmenides says it's not possible. How can he be right? Parmenides says, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes, right? He wanted to argue that change is not possible because reason tells you that it's impossible. Reason tells you that the very idea of change is incoherent, and so you shouldn't believe your senses. Parmenides was maybe the first of the rationalists in this sense, that reason has priority over sensory experience and should be trusted when it conflicts with sensory experience. His argument for this claim is actually a bit complicated, but to simplify it, Parmenides argues that to change would be to go from non-being to being. The idea being that, well, if any change occurs, right, so Feser's not talking, and then suddenly he's talking, right, his talking has to go from not happening to happening, has to go from non-existence to existence, from non-being to being. So Parmenides says. Okay. So change would have to involve going from non-being to being. But that's absurd, Parmenides argued, since non-being is just nothing, and something can come from nothing. From nothing, nothing comes. Something can't come from nothing. So therefore, ergo, change is impossible, Parmenides argues. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's the basic idea. Now, what Parmenides overlooked, according to Aristotle, is that between non-being on the one hand and unqualified being or actuality on the other, there is potency or potentiality. Again, the rubber ball is not actually soft and gooey, but it is at least potentially that way. And this potentiality is what makes change possible. Aristotle would say that Parmenides and Zeno, his disciple Zeno, were simply too crude in their understanding of how change would have to work. It's not a matter of going from absolute non-being to actuality, to complete being, but going from potential existence. There is in the rubber ball, though it's not actually squishy and gooey, the potential to be that way, which other things don't have, right? You stick a block of granite in the microwave, it's not going to melt, but you stick the rubber ball in, it will. The ball has a potency or potential to melt at that temperature in a way that the block of granite does not. So we can say something about it that's true even though it's not actually the case. It has a potentiality that hasn't yet been actualized. And that's what makes change possible. That basic point, the distinction between actual and potential, is the key to seeing what's wrong with Parmenides. Now, notice that insofar as the ball has the potential to be soft and gooey, even before it is melted down, and even if it's never melted, right, the rubber ball has that potential or potency, even if you keep it in a drawer and you never stick it in the microwave, you never put it out in the sun, it never actually melts. It still has that potency or potentiality. Notice that it has a kind of disposition, you might say, and therefore points to or is directed at a certain effect or manifestation. Built into the nature of the thing, insofar as it has the potential to melt, is a tendency to point to that outcome under the right conditions. In other words, it exhibits final causality or teleology in the sense that we discussed last night. There is a deep connection between the distinction between act and potency, or actuality and potentiality on the one hand, and the notion of final causality or teleology on the other hand. It is no surprise then that the new essentialist philosophers that we discussed last night, in resurrecting the idea of dispositions or causal powers and teleology along with them, have also emphasized the distinction between what they call categorical properties and dispositional ones, which is just kind of a fancy modern way of talking about the old actuality, potentiality distinction. Here's another way in which they're basically resurrecting Aristotelian ideas. Some of them are well aware of this, some of them are not, but it's basically a neo-Aristotelian approach coming from people who are in no way interested in defending God's existence, or they're not Thomists or what have you. So it's sort of developed independently. Nor is it any surprise that with the abandonment of final causality in early modern philosophy, and the work of people like Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and others, that attention to and even awareness of Aristotle's actuality-potentiality distinction virtually disappeared, and that with it, away with it went a proper understanding of what Aquinas was trying to do in arguments like the first way. For the act potency or actuality potentiality distinction is crucial to the argument, and indeed, in one way or the other, to all of Aquinas' arguments. It really plays a role in the other arguments too. Excuse me. Now, how exactly does a potential become actualized? To return to my examples, the ball melting into goo and the dog walking, how does the ball's potential gooiness, if that's a word, come into being, and how do the dog's muscles actualize their potential to be flexed? Well, it cannot happen by itself, for potential is by itself just that. It's merely potential, not actual or real. So that no potential can make itself actual, but must be actualized by something outside it. Hence, a rubber ball's potential to be melted must be actualized by heat. The potential of an animal's leg to move must be actualized by the firing of the motor neurons, and so forth. What we have here, of course, is a cause and effect relationship. But notice that it is not a relationship between events separated in time, like the throwing of a brick, which is followed a second or two later by the shattering of a window. Rather, the causes and effects in the cases at hand are simultaneous. The effect of the rubber ball melting is simultaneous with the heats causing it to melt. The effect of the dog's muscles flexing is simultaneous with the neurons causing them to flex. To take another example Aristotelian philosophers like to use, when a potter makes a pot, the effect of the pot's taking on a curved shape is simultaneous with the potter's hand taking a curved position as he molds it. In general, for Aristotle and Aquinas, the immediate cause of a thing is always simultaneous with it. Now, by the same token, the curved position of the potter's hand is itself immediately caused by whatever events in his nervous system keep the muscles in his hand flexed in such and such a way. But of course, we can also point to other less immediate causes of the curved position of his hand. For example, it was remotely caused by the fact that his girlfriend asked him last week to make a pot for her, for he wouldn't be sitting here right now curving his hand in just that way if she hadn't made this request. This brings us to a crucial distinction that Aquinas and other medieval philosophers made between two kinds of series of causes and effects, namely accidentally ordered and essentially ordered series, or causal series ordered per accidens and per se. And here I can make reference to the handout, or one side of it, I think it's two-sided, and you'll see a little chart there on accidentally ordered versus essentially ordered causal series, summarizing some of the crucial differences between them, which I'm going to describe now. To take a stock example of an accidentally ordered causal series, consider a father who begets a son who in turn begets another. If the father dies after begetting his son, the son can still beget a son of his own. For once in existence, the son has the power to do this all by himself. He doesn't need his father to remain in existence for him to be able to do it. If we imagine an ongoing series of fathers begetting sons, who in turn beget others, and of course such series really do exist all around us, then we can observe that in every case, each son has the power to beget a son of his own, and thus become a father, even if his own father or any previous father in the series goes out of existence. Considered as a causer of sons, if you will, each member of this series is in this sense independent of the previous members. Hence, the series is accidentally ordered in the sense that it is not essential to the continuation of the series that any earlier member of it remain in existence. And in the same way, the potter's curving his hand in making the pot occurs even though his girlfriend's request happened a week ago. The causal link between her request and the potter's hand's curving is also accidental in the relevant sense, insofar as the latter exists in the absence of the former. So that's one kind of cause and effect relationship. Call it an accidentally ordered cause and effect relationship. And it's the kind we normally have in mind when we think of series of causes arranged in a linear way through a span of time, illustrated on the handout there by that, that straight line, A causes B, which causes C, and so forth. Now, the potter's hand being curved would not exist in the absence of the firing of the motor neurons. Here we have an essentially ordered causal series, and we have one precisely because the cause in this case is, unlike the girlfriend's request, simultaneous with the effect. The hand is held in the position that it is in only because the motor neurons are firing in such and such a way. Take away the neural activity and the hand goes limp. Or, once again, to make use of a stock example, if we think of the hand which is pushing a stone by means of a stick, this is Aquinas' example, and it's there on the handout. The motion of the stone occurs only insofar as the stick is moving it. And if the stick is moving only insofar as it is being used by the hand to do so. At every moment in which the last part of the series, that is the motion of the stone, exists, the earlier parts, the motion of the hand and the stick, exist as well. The stone and the stick itself, for that matter, only move because and insofar as the hand moves them. Indeed, strictly speaking, it is the hand alone which is doing the moving of the stone, and the stick is a mere instrument by means of which it accomplishes this. The series is essentially ordered, quote unquote, because the later members of the series, having no independent power of motion, derive the fact of their motion and their ability to move other things from the first member, in this case, the hand. Without the earlier members, and particularly the first one, the series could not continue. Okay, that's the basic distinction between essentially and accidentally ordered series. Now, an accidentally ordered series, like the fathers begetting sons who beget more sons, and indeed like the countless other causal series familiar from everyday experience that extend backwards in time, could, in Aquinas' view, in theory, go back forever into the past. He doesn't think any such series does in fact go back forever, but he also doesn't think it can be proved through philosophical arguments that they don't. This is one area where I think Aquinas was mistaken, but it's not relevant to the point here. His view is that, well, we can't prove through philosophy or science alone that if you trace a series of essentially ordered causes back in time, that you must reach a beginning point. That was his position. And that's why he didn't think you could prove that the universe had an origin, and that he wasn't going to bother with that sort of question in the course of arguing for God's existence. The reason is that since in an accidentally ordered series, the members of the series have their causal powers independently of the operation or even the existence of earlier members, there's nothing about the activity of the members existing here and now that requires that we trace it back to some first member existing in the past. So in an accidentally ordered causal series, like the son begetting a further son and so forth, it's the son who's begetting a son of his own. It's not that the father is begetting this grandson through the son. The son has this independent causal power. So to explain what's going on here and now in that sort of series, you don't need to appeal to the father or the grandfather or the great-grandfather. You can just stop with the son himself and his independent power to generate new sons. And for that reason, Aquinas wants to say there's no grounds to say that the series must have some first member, because you don't have to appeal to a first member who's moving through all the other ones, working through all the other ones as instruments, the way you have in an essentially ordered causal series. Things are different than with an essentially ordered causal series. These sorts of series trace not backwards in time, but rather downward or upward, depending on what sort of metaphor you want to use, in the present moment, since they are series in which each member depends simultaneously on other members, which simultaneously depend in turn on yet others, and so on. In this sort of series, the later members have no independent causal power of their own. That's really the crucial idea here. Every member except the first one has no independent power. It can only do anything insofar as it's being used as an instrument of something else. They have no independent causal power of their own, being mere instruments of a first member. Hence, if there were no first member, such a series would not exist at all. If the last member of such series does in fact exist, then, as the motion of the stone does in our example, this series cannot even in theory go back infinitely. There must be a first member. That's just the nature of that kind of causation, essentially ordered causation, that kind of series. And that is the sort of series Aquinas, as I indicate there at the bottom of the handout, that's the sort of series he's talking about when he says that the series of causes cannot go back to infinity. If you take a look at the other side of the handout, you see on the top I have a little outline there of Aquinas' first way, which corresponds pretty closely to what he says in the Summa. When he says that the series of changers, one thing moving another, can't be infinite, what he means then is not that if you trace it back in time you'll get to a Big Bang and then we ask what caused the Big Bang. He's not interested in that at all. He's talking about the causes and effects going on here and now in an essentially ordered way. And it's that sort of series he says must have necessarily, of its very nature, a first member. All right, now we'll come back to that. With that background in place, we can finally proceed to the argument from motion itself, the one I've got Aquinas' version of there outlined on the top of the handout. Consider once again the hand, the stone, and the stick. The stone, as I've said, moves only insofar as the stick moves, and the stick moves only insofar as the hand moves. More technically, but more precisely, the stone's potentiality for motion is actualized by the stick, but only because simultaneously the stick's potentiality for motion is actualized by the hand. That's where we left things when I first set up the example a few moments ago, treating the hand for purposes of illustration as if it were a first mover. But of course, in fact, the hand is not really the first member of the series at all. It moves only because the arm moves it, and the arm and hand together move only because the relevant muscles flex, which is in turn due to the firing of certain neurons. That is to say, the hand's potentiality for motion is actualized by the arm's potentiality for motion is actualized by the muscles' potentiality for motion is actualized by the nerves. And again, all of this is simultaneous. But even this isn't the end of the series. It continues on through a number of simultaneous steps to ever deeper levels of reality. The motion of the stone depends on the motion of the hand, which depends on the motion of the stick, which depends on the firing of the neurons, which depends on the firing of other neurons, all of which depends on the state of the nervous system, which depends on its current molecular structure, which depends on the atomic basis of that molecular structure, which depends on electromagnetism, gravitation, the weak and strong forces, and so on and so forth, all simultaneously, all here and now. The actualization, to put it in somewhat more technical but more precise, I think, jargon, is that the actualization of one potential depends on the simultaneous actualization of another, which depends on the simultaneous actualization of another, which depends on the simultaneous actualization of another, which depends on how far can this go? Not that far, actually. Certainly not to infinity. For what we have here is an essentially ordered causal series existing here and now, not an accidentally ordered one extending backwards to the past. And an essentially ordered series of its nature must have a first member. All the later members of such a series exist at all only insofar as the earlier ones do, and those earlier ones only insofar as yet earlier ones do. But were there finally no first member of the series, there'd be no series at all in the first place, because it is only the first member which is in the strictest sense really doing or actualizing anything. The later members are mere instruments with no independent actualizing power of their own. Suppose you see the caboose of a train. Give some illustrations here of the basic concept. Suppose you see the caboose of a train pulling out at the station and demand to know what's pulling it. A freight car, you were told. What's pulling that? Another freight car. And that? Yet another freight car. All true enough. But none of these answers really explains anything, because the freight cars, like the caboose, have no independent power of motion of their own, and so no appeal to freight cars explains anything, at least, or even if the series of cars pulling the caboose went on to infinity. What is needed is an appeal to something that does have the power of movement in itself, such as an engine car. Similarly, should you see through a hole in the fence, say, a paintbrush coating the fence with paint, and ask what is causing it to do so, the answer, the brush handle, will not explain anything, since a brush handle has no independent power of movement. And this wouldn't change in the least, even if we imagined the brush handle was infinitely long. It's not like, well, a short brush handle can't move itself, it needs a hand to move it. But if you had an infinitely long brush handle, that would explain everything. That doesn't add anything to the explanatory picture. And this wouldn't change in the least, even if we imagined that the brush handle was infinitely long. Again, the only genuine explanation would be something that did have independent power of movement and could therefore move the otherwise inert brush. The same thing is true of the sequence beginning with the moving stone. No member of the series has any independent causal power of its own, but derives what it has from something earlier in the series. As with the railway cars and the paintbrush, this series too must terminate in a first mover which moves all the others, indeed moves through all the others. Now, a first mover in this sort of series itself must be unmoved or unchanging. For if it were moving or changing, that is, if it was itself going from potential to actual, then there would have to be something outside it actualizing its potential, in which case it wouldn't be the first mover. Not only must it be unmoved, though, it must be unmovable, unchangeable. For notice that especially toward the lower levels of the series we were considering, we get to the nervous systems being actualized by its molecular structure, which is in turn actualized by its atomic structure, etc. What we have is the potential existence of one level actualized by the existence of another, which is in turn actualized by another, and so forth. The existence of neurons is actualized by the molecular structure, the existence of the molecular structure is actualized by the atomic structure, and so on. To account for the actualization of the potential motion of the stone, we had eventually to appeal to the actualization of the potential existence of various deeper levels of reality. And here, I'm going beyond what Aquinas actually says in the text of the First Way, and I'm considering the argument as it's been understood in the longer Thomistic tradition. And I would certainly argue that the basic idea of the argument for motion, which is really about the actualization of potential rather than a specific kind of motion or change, leads us ultimately to give a final explanation of the motion we started out with, like the stone, to the need to explain the existence of the stone, the existence of the stick moving the stone, and so on and so forth. But then the only way to stop this regress and to arrive at a first member of the series is with a being whose existence does not need to be actualized by anything else. The series can only stop, that is to say, with a being that is pure actuality or pure act, as the medieval scholastic philosophers would put it, with no admixture of potentiality whatsoever. And having no potentiality to realize or actualize, such a being could not possibly move or change. Doesn't come into being, doesn't go out of existence, doesn't change in any respect. It is pure being, pure existence, pure actuality. That a stone is moved by a hand via a stick then, and more generally that things change at all, suffices to show that there is and indeed must be a first unmovable mover or unchangeable changer. Now that is all pretty abstract, I realize, so much so that it might seem jarring when Aquinas goes on to say, quote, "and this we call God," as he does at the end of the first way. What he means by this is that whatever else people might have in mind when they use the expression God, because obviously the proverbial man on the street doesn't think of God as pure actuality or in these, these sort of abstract Aristotelian terms. But Aquinas' point is that whatever else we have in mind when we use the expression God, we mean to refer to whatever being it is that is the ultimate explanation of the processes of change we observe in the world around us. God is the ultimate cause of everything. I mean, that certainly is part of the ordinary man on the street's idea of God, even if he doesn't think of it in these highfalutin, technical, scholastic terms. It turns out that there really is such a being. And it also turns out that what it means for there to be such a being is for there to be a being describable in philosophical terms as pure actuality, even if this has, of course, never occurred to most people who believe in God. All well and good, you might be thinking, but what does that have to do with God as the average person understands him? A lot, actually. For once we have this much in hand, we can go on to deduce all sorts of things about what a being of pure actuality would have to be like. And it turns out that such a being would have to be exactly like the God of traditional Western religious belief. I keep saying a being, and I'm speaking very loosely here, as any good Thomist will tell you, God is not a being. He is being itself, rather than one being among others. So I'm speaking loosely here. For example, there cannot possibly be more than one being who is pure actuality. Hence, the argument from motion leads inevitably to a kind of monotheism. One reason for this is that in order for there to be two or more purely actual beings, there would have to be some way, in principle at least, of distinguishing them. Some feature that one of them had that the other one lacked. And there just couldn't be any such feature. For to lack a feature is just to have an unrealized potentiality, and a purely actual being, by definition, has no unrealized potentialities. He's already, as it were, pure actuality. There's nothing there to be actualized, no potentiality. So if we said, for example, that one purely actual being was more powerful than another, that is what distinguished him from the other one, then we'd be saying in effect that the other purely actual being had failed to realize this potential for power as fully as the first had, say. Which makes no sense, given that what we're talking about is a purely actual being with no potentialities of any sort. So again, there's no feature that one purely actual being could have that another could lack, and thus no way even in theory to distinguish one purely actual being from another. So there couldn't be more than one. There's a lot more to it than that, but the idea is that when you unpack the concept of pure actuality, of God as what actualizes or makes real everything else without himself having to be actualized or makes real. He is pure existence, pure reality, pure actuality. When you unpack that, you'll see you can't make sense of the idea of there being more than one such cause of the world, necessarily unique. A being of pure actuality lacking any potentiality whatsoever would also have to be immaterial. It's not a material object. It's not just the universe, say, or some prior material universe that caused this one, or any of these other sort of material causes. Since to be a material thing entails being changeable in various ways, which a purely actual being cannot be. Such a being would not come into existence or go out of existence, both of these being instances of change, but simply exist always. In fact, he would have to be eternal or outside of time and space altogether, since to be within time and space also entails changeability. The unmoved mover is in any event the source to which every motion or change in the material universe, not just moving stones, but melting glaciers, orbiting moons, budding flowers, growing boys and girls, and so on through all of nature, traces back. Being the common first member of all the various essentially ordered causal series that result in these instances of change, the unmoved mover is outside and distinct from them as that which sustains the entire world in motion from instant to instant. Excuse me. So just from what has been said so far, we can see that the unmoved mover or unchangeable changer must be absolutely unique, immutable or unchangeable, immaterial or pure spirit, eternal and outside of time and space. Obviously, there's a lot more to the arguments for these attributes than what I've said here, but I'm just trying to give you a little sense of the general approach. Can we say more than this? We can, by way of the Aristotelian principle, that whatever is in an effect must in some sense be contained in its cause as well. This is an idea that's sometimes called in the scholastic literature the principle of proportionate causality. The basic idea is that a cause cannot give to its effect what it does not have to give, and it can be illustrated by a simple example. Suppose you come across a puddle of water near an outdoor spigot, an outdoor faucet. You'll naturally conclude that the puddle was caused by the spigot, either because someone turned it on or because it's leaking. The effect is a puddle of water, and the cause is something fully capable of producing that effect, since it contains water in it already. But now suppose instead that you come across a puddle of thick, sticky, dark red liquid near the same spigot. In this case, you will not conclude that the faucet was the cause, at least not by itself. The reason is that there's nothing in the spigot or faucet alone that could produce this specific effect, or at least not every feature of the effect. It could produce a puddle of liquid all right, and maybe even a puddle of vaguely reddish liquid if there was rust in the line, but not a puddle of thick, sticky, dark red liquid specifically. You'd be likely to conclude instead that someone had spilled a can of soda pop near the spigot, or perhaps someone had been bleeding heavily nearby. Even if these possibilities had been ruled out, and you had evidence that the puddle came from the spigot after all, you conclude that somehow such a thick red liquid, blood, soda, or whatever, had somehow been put into the water line, or that if it had not, there must have been something on the ground that when mixed with water from the spigot chemically produced this thick red liquid. What you would never seriously consider is the suggestion that normal water from the faucet all by itself produced the red puddle. For there's just nothing in water by itself that could produce the redness, thickness, or stickiness of the puddle. There must have been something in addition to the water that produced the effect. Halfway expected to see red, thick, bloody, okay. Freaking myself out here, okay. As this example illustrates, an effect might be contained in its cause in various ways. It could be that the cause was itself red, as blood or cherry soda pop is red even before it causes a red puddle. But it could also be that the cause was not itself red, but had the power to generate redness in the effect. For example, neither the water nor some chemical substance spread on the ground, like a ground up fizzy drink tablet or something, might be red, yet it will produce a thick red liquid when combined. Or to take another example, the cause of a fire might itself be on fire, as when a torch is used to start a brush fire, or it may instead have the power to produce fire, as a cigarette lighter has even when it's not being used. The traditional way of making this distinction is to say that a cause has the feature that it generates in the effect formally in the first sort of case. For example, when both the cause and effect are red or on fire. They both have the form of being on fire, the form of red. So the idea is that what's in the effect is in the cause formally. That's the technical jargon. And it's in the cause eminently in the second sort of case. For example, when the cause is not itself red or on fire, but it has an inherent power to produce redness or fire. Or you could think of the way, another sort of example, when an architect produces a house that's made out of bricks and it's 2 stories high and it's red and so forth. Well, the architect himself isn't made out of bricks, right? He's not, he doesn't have 2 stories, you know. How many stories does your architect have, right? What are you talking about, his life story? You know, he doesn't have stories in that sense at all. But nevertheless, what's in the house is in the architect in yet another way, as an idea, as a concept in his intellect. So there are different ways in which what's in the effect might be in the cause. It doesn't always have to be in the same way. All right. Now, if a cause didn't contain all the features of its effect, either formally or eminently, it didn't have it in some way in itself. The cause didn't have in itself what was in the effect. Then there would be no way to account for how the effect came about in just the way that it did. We couldn't make sense of the cause and effect relationship in the first place. Again, a cause cannot give to its effect what it does not have to give. You can only give what you've got. a principle Aristotelian philosophers, as I say, call the principle of proportionate causality. Now, with this principle in hand, let's return to the unmoved mover or unchangeable changer. Since he's the source of all change, he's the source of all things coming to have the attributes that they have. Hence, he must have these attributes eminently, if not formally. That is to say, if he does not have these attributes in precisely the way that the things he causes have, he must have them in some higher or more eminent way. For example, if he doesn't have attributes like color, weight, or shape, which of course he does not have since he's not a material object, he would nevertheless have to have something like, say, the ideas or concepts of color, weight, and shape, and the power to cause these things. Otherwise, he couldn't be the ultimate explanation of why things come to have these features, which we have seen that he is. But the unmoved mover or unchangeable changer is the source of every attribute things have, including every power. As their source, then, he must be all-powerful. He is also the source of the intellect and will that human beings possess, features that make us persons rather than mere animals or inanimate objects, and capable of knowing or understanding the world around us. It follows that the unmoved mover or unchangeable changer must be said to have something analogous to intellect and will, and thus knowledge and personality. That is to say, he is indeed a he and not an it, or some impersonal force. Moreover, he must have these various attributes in the highest degree, since, as we've seen, he would lack any of the limitations that go along with being a material creature or with having any sort of potentiality. Hence, he not only has knowledge, but knowledge without limit. He would be all-knowing. To show that an unmoved mover or unchangeable changer exists, then, is just to show that there is a single being who is the cause of all change, himself unchangeable, immaterial, eternal, personal, having intelligence and will, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. It is, in short, to show that there is a God in the traditional sense. Now, that is actually just the sketch of the argument. It could be pursued in much greater detail. In particular, much more could be said in response to the various objections that atheists might try to raise against this line of reasoning. But enough has been said already to show how wide of the mark certain stock atheist criticisms are. For example, you'll find a great many atheist writers, Richard Dawkins among them, who claim that even if it could be shown that there is a first cause or unmoved mover, no one has ever given a reason to think that this cause would be all-powerful, all-knowing, or in other ways like the God of traditional religious belief. That's a stock objection. That, well, even if we gave you a cause of the world, there's no reason to think that it has any of the features we traditionally attribute to God, something with intellect, will, power, knowledge, and so on and so forth, that there's only one of them, and so on and so forth. But that claim, though extremely common, is simply false. Indeed, it is breathtaking that so many atheist writers get away with saying this so frequently. In fact, many of the great philosophical theologians, and Aquinas is just the most eminent of them, certainly not the only one, devote literally hundreds of pages of rigorous philosophical argument to showing that a first cause or unmoved mover would have to have all the various divine attributes. And though I've just given a sketch of how this can be shown, hopefully I've said enough to give the lie to this particular atheist cliche. It's very annoying. It's one of my many pet peeves that, someone like Richard Dawkins can say, well, even if Aquinas got us to a first cause, it doesn't tell us anything about why this first cause is all-powerful, all-knowing. And I want to say, just, Dawkins, turn the page, man. I mean, all he's ever read, apparently, is a snippet of Aquinas, probably the 5 Ways, something he read in a philosophy anthology when he was an undergraduate, but clearly not the Summa Theologiae itself, because if you look at that book, right after Aquinas gives you the 5 Ways, which were only ever intended as a little summary, a sketch of arguments he develops at much greater length elsewhere, and that would have just been familiar, would have been just in the air, as it were, during the time in which he wrote. You just turn the page and you see that he immediately launches into a very long, hundreds of pages long, set of arguments for the different divine attributes. So far from being the case that these defenders of the traditional arguments only at best ever get you to a cause of the world, but never tell you anything about the nature of this cause. It's just simply untrue. No one could possibly say that who's actually read Aquinas or Samuel Clarke or any of the other, or Leibniz, or any of the other great defenders of the idea of God as cause of the world. Now, atheist writers also often claim that even if it could be shown that there was a first cause, we couldn't know whether this being still exists here and now. It's the deadbeat dad theory of God, that, well, maybe he caused the world, but he took off, right? Maybe we should go after him for child support. If Dawkins thought of that, he'd probably have a crusade, let's sue God, for... Anyway. We've seen, though, why this objection is no good. as I've emphasized, the argument from motion that we've been sketching out does not say that we need to trace the history of the universe back to the Big Bang and postulate God as the cause of the Big Bang, which of course would raise the question of how we could know that this cause is still around. No, the argument says instead that if we are going to explain any change or motion going on here and now, including even my speaking this very sentence, including Richard Dawkins uttering a blasphemy, or Christopher Hitchens ordering a scotch, then there logically must be an unmoved mover or unchangeable changer who's causing such change or motion to occur here and now. This would remain true whether or not the universe had a beginning, a question which, at least for the purposes of proving God's existence, is in Aquinas' view irrelevant. We can also see that the stock objection to the phantom everything has a cause, so the universe has a cause argument is irrelevant. Aquinas doesn't say everything has a cause or that everything is in motion. If you look at the little outline of his argument I gave there, you'll see there's nothing like that premise. What he says is if something goes from potential to actual, there must be something outside that makes that happen. But that's very different from saying everything has a cause. What you see in the bottom half of that handout, by the way, I noted earlier that Aquinas speaks in terms of motion or change. In Aquinas' day, everyone would have understood that what that means from an Aristotelian point of view is going from potency to act, or potential to actual. These days, people are they're just not used to that sort of jargon. I think it's more helpful, even though a bit more difficult to get your mind around it, but once you sort of get used to that jargon of potency and act, it's more useful, it's far less misleading to state the argument in those terms. So what I've got there on the second half of the handout is the way I would restate the argument without using the concept of, without using the term, I should say, motion or change, but just stating the basic thrust of the argument in terms of the actualization of potency. So that's, you got a little reconstruction there on the bottom half of the handout. All right. What Aquinas does do is just to note that there are things that are moving or changing in that sense, going from potency to act, and shows that this would not be possible even in theory, wouldn't be possible even in theory for something to go from potential to actual here and now, unless there were something that is not moving or changing or being caused in any way, something that could not be moved or changed, could not be moved or changed, or in any other way dependent on some cause outside itself, operating here and now to make all this happen. And the reason this unmoved mover or first cause cannot just be the universe itself is that whatever the unmoved mover or first cause is must be pure actuality without any potentiality and thus itself incapable of change, which of course the ever-changing material universe is not. Finally, we might note that the argument is also immune to what might seem to be a more serious objection from modern science. Someone might ask, doesn't Newton's principle of inertia, the principle that a body in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon from outside, undermine the claim of Aristotle, Aquinas, and other defenders of the argument from motion that whatever is moving must here and now be moved by something else? For if it's just a law of physics that bodies will, all things being equal, remain in motion, then why would there be a need to appeal to anything outside them in order to account for their continued movement? Now, this objection too, I would claim, is irrelevant to the argument for several reasons. First of them is that Newton's principle applies only to what is called local motion, or movement from one place to another, while the sort of motion the argument from motion is concerned with is broader and concerns change in general, change of any sort. Not just movement from place to place, but also changes in quality, like water's becoming solid when it freezes, changes in quantity, like it's becoming hotter or colder by degrees, and changes in substance, as when hydrogen and oxygen are combined to make water. So even if we were to grant that the local motion of an object needn't be accounted for by reference to something outside it, there would still be other kinds of motion to which the argument from motion would apply. I mean, that's one move you could make. I don't think it's the most fundamental one, though. Someone might try to argue that those other kinds of motion might be reduced to local motion. I don't think that actually works for several reasons. But the more fundamental response, though, is this. The most fundamental problem with the Newtonian objection is that the operation of Newton's law is itself something that needs to be explained. It's no good saying, oh, things keep moving because, that's just what they do given the principle of inertia. If we want to know why things are governed by this principle, it's no good just to say, well, it's a law of physics that things operate that way. Okay, what does that mean? What does it mean to say it's a law that they operate that way? What does that mean if it's not, well, they just operate that way because, that's the way things operate? That's a brilliant explanation, right? That's not going to do. The analytical Thomist philosopher David Brain characterizes this sort of thinking as beholden to what he aptly calls the mythology of inertia. And he quotes the following lines from Wittgenstein's Tractatus to indicate what is wrong with it. It's a quote from the early Wittgenstein, quote, "The whole modern conception of the world is founded on the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are the explanations of natural phenomena. Thus, people today stop at the laws of nature, treating them as something inviolable, just as God and fate were treated in past ages. And in fact, both are right and both wrong, though the view of the ancients is clearer insofar as they have a clear and acknowledged terminus, while the modern system tries to make it look as if everything were explained," unquote. From an Aristotelian point of view, talk of, quote, laws of nature can really only just be shorthand for a description of how things tend to behave given their natures, their forms, their essences. But that just raises the question of why a thing exists with the nature, form, or essence that it has. Part of the answer is that a certain parcel of matter has taken on that form, nature, or essence. But this brings us back to the distinction between actuality and potentiality. For from an Aristotelian point of view, matter considered by itself is purely potential unless actualized by some form or nature. But the form, nature, or essence of a material thing, considered by itself, is in turn an abstraction. It exists in the real world only insofar as some matter has taken on that form or essence. The Aristotelian analysis of material objects is holistic. Form exists only in matter, but matter exists only insofar as it has form, only insofar as it is informed. For that reason, the form, nature, or essence of a thing, and thus the laws that it follows, including Newton's laws, can never be its ultimate explanation. We need to appeal to something outside the composite of form and matter, of actuality and potentiality, if we're to avoid vicious circularity. And only what is purely actual, what can actualize other things without being actualized itself. It's not a bit of matter, or more broadly, potentiality, which is being actualized. It just is pure actuality. Only something like that, in short, God, as conceived of in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, can, even in principle, be the terminus of explanation. That which keeps the form and matter together, that which keeps the laws of physics going, as it were, from moment to moment to moment. As Aquinas puts it, to say that God made the world is more like saying the musician made music than it is like saying the blacksmith made a horseshoe. The world is not like a horseshoe. It's not some artifact that God made all at once at some point in the past and which might carry on by itself even in his absence. The world is more like a melody played by a violinist, where if the violinist stops playing, even for an instant, then the music stops too. We are, as it were, all mere notes in God's melody and would not be able to so much as lift a finger were he not continuously moving his own fingers across the violin strings. He is at every moment creating us, keeping us in existence, including those who deny his existence, and even as they foolishly deny it. Thank you.